Okay, everybody, so we've been walking through 1 Samuel, and it's here in 1 Samuel that we've been looking at the downfall of King Saul and the appointment of David as king. Last week, we spent some time talking about really two things. We were looking at the geography of the land, and we were looking at how Israel was divided into sort of four north-south corridors. On the east side, next to the Mediterranean, we had this coastal region, which is flat. And then next to that, the next north-south corridor was the hill country. And this is that section of land that rose from the coastal region and peaked at Jerusalem. And it was very mountainous. And then as you continue going from the west to the east, now we're at the top of Jerusalem and we descend severely down until we get to the Jordan River. And that's where Jericho was, for example. And then on the other side of Jericho, the land rises again to a plateau. And this is where, like, the bulls of Bashan were. You know, this was a very fertile area. So we talked about that, and we spent most of our time talking about those two corridors on the east side, on the western side, next to the coastal plain and the mountain region. And there was this buffer zone. And the buffer zone is what we refer to as the Shephelah. It was an area of land that was hotly contested from a military standpoint because it was critical to guarding the roads that traveled from the area that was inhabited by the Philistines on the coastal plain and the area that was inhabited by the people of Israel up on the mountains. And so in order for the Philistines to get up into the mountains where the Jews were, they had to go through the Shephelah, and they would approach these roads through what was known as these Wadi valleys. These were river runoffs. This was water runoff that would create these dry riverbeds, and it made a really easy way for the people to travel. Otherwise, it would be like climbing Mount Washington all the time, up on the rocks, and it would have been a challenging thing. So the story of David and Goliath was that the Philistines were encamped in Gaza, which, you know, in Gath, which was on the coastal plain, and the Israelites were up in the mountains, and they came down to the Shephelah, and this is where the battle was. And so we spent a lot of time talking about the battle and talking about whether David, in fact, was an underdog or not. And I don't know if any of you have heard or read Malcolm Gladwell before. Anybody read or know of Malcolm Gladwell? He's, I think, a really interesting author. He's written a book called The Tipping Point. He did write a book on David and Goliath. And a lot of what I took from class last week, was some of the information that he had shared. Malcolm Gladwell has a book on David and Goliath. He's got a short YouTube video if you're interested in seeing that. It's really good, and I'd recommend it. But what we were talking about in terms of the battle was that the Israelites looked at Goliath, and they saw this giant, and they thought, he's too big to fight. And David looks at this giant and says, he's too big to miss. And we talked about the skills that David would have developed over time, and I think that's where we ended. And so the class ended last week, of course, with David defeating Goliath. And this is a story that we've known since childhood. And sometimes it's nice to go and take a look at it again, because sometimes we know these things so well that we don't really get into the detail. So I'd like to have you turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we'll come to the conclusion of the matter, and that's found in 1 Samuel 17, verse 50, and it says in this passage, "So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him." And then I'll have you take a look at the 55th verse. And it's in this verse where it says, Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine. And he said to Abner, commander of the army, Abner, whose son is that young man? And I thought that was, I think that's sort of an interesting question. You know, there's part of me that wonders, why is Saul asking this? Is he asking this because he has to figure out, okay, who do we notify after this young boy's been killed? Right? Or is he asking for other reasons? And there's a part of me that thinks that Saul had the motive of trying to determine whether this man, this young man David, was, whether he was the child of anybody that was of import or not. And if David was not a child of import, if he didn't have a good family, or an important family, well, maybe that he could become useful to Saul in some way. And I'm trying to set the stage, because what we're going to see is David is going to offer one of his daughters to David as a wife. And if you think about that, the king offering one of his children to another person, usually there's some political motivation for that in those days. In order for, if a king were to offer his daughter to someone else, it would be to garner some political advantage. And we see this all the time when kings from one nation are having their children marry kings from another nation. And when Saul asks the question, whose son is this? It's almost like, what's going on here? Like, if I'm to offer my daughter to this boy, like, what can I get out of it? And there's a part of me that wonders that. So, it's just conjecture, but we'll see that, and I'll try and develop that as the story goes on this morning. Any comments or questions so far? Okay. So let's take a look at chapter 18. It begins and says, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. And I get the sense here that Jonathan probably was either part of that conversation with David and Jonathan's father, or Jonathan overheard it. There was something that was going on there that caused Jonathan to develop this bond of friendship with David, to feel this unity in spirit with David. We don't know what it is. We don't know why it is. But my thinking is that if Jonathan is described as having loved David as himself, as becoming one in spirit with David, there would have had to have been some connection there. And the connection in my mind, as I read the passage, is that Jonathan probably heard the conversation that David had with Saul. And it says in verse 2, from that day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. Interesting, right? Did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. And whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. And this pleased all the people and Saul's officers too. Verse 6. When men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine. Now what's anybody have a note in their margin? Is this singular or plural in the King James? We're looking at verse 6.
Yeah, it's plural.
Plural in the King James? Yeah, and it makes sense, I think. So some of the modern translations will translate it singularly, like, that after David had returned from killing the Philistine, presumably Goliath. But some of the other versions will translate it as Philistines. And it seems to make sense, I think, that it's translated in the plural, because the next passage is where we get that famous refrain, Saul has killed his thousands, and David has killed his tens of thousands. So in my mind, again, I'm sort of reading between the lines. I'm assuming here that there were these continual battles between the Philistines and the Israelites. This Shephelah area, the place between the hill country and the flat coastal region where the Philistines lived, this was a continual battleground. They were always fighting down there. And David had once again probably gone in and had a battle with the people. And because God was with David, we're told that he was blessed and that he was very, very successful. So verse 6 again, when they were returning home after David had killed the Philistines, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with tambourines and lutes. And as they danced, they sang, Saul slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And this grated on Saul, of course, right? It says that Saul was very angry, and this refrain galled him. And I think the reason for that, brothers and sisters, is twofold. One, jealousy is something that we all experience in life. And it's one of the things that is challenging in life. You know, we can look at the success of others and we can envy their success. We can covet the things that they have. And it's one of the problems of the flesh. And this is no different for Saul than it is for you and me. And so Saul saw the accolades that were being laid at David and became very jealous. And there's a proverb that I want to have you turn to, and it's Proverbs 27. And it's this proverb that speaks a little bit about jealousy. So I'll just have you flip there because I think it is appropriate. It's Proverbs 27, verse 4. And it's comparing jealousy to other things like anger. Sometimes, you think, well, what's the most challenging thing we face? A lot of times people say, I really struggle with patience, or anger. But what this proverb says is that anger is cruel and fury overwhelming, but who can stand before jealousy? And I think that it's just an interesting passage to me, that it shows us the importance of trying to understand how challenging jealousy can be in our lives and how it's something that we really need to fight. We are to esteem one another greater than ourselves. And we are to rejoice, I think, in the success of others rather than feel jealous about it. Any comments or questions? Sandy?
Well, because it's more internal, no one can cause jealousy, it only comes from you.
Sandy says it's no one causes jealousy, it's internal, it only comes from you. And I think that's true. But is that not true of anger? Yeah, you can be provoked to anger.
People can have things or, be happy and not cause that jealousy. They can't provoke jealousy. I don't know.
Yeah, it's difficult to provoke jealousy, whereas people can provoke anger, Sandy says. Were you going to say something, Mom?
Yeah, I was just saying, verse 4 in King James, anger is outrageous. That's interesting.
So in the King James, Proverbs 4, 27:4 says, anger is outrageous. Yeah, uh-oh. Somebody's got the microphone. Yeah.
Just a comment on the relationship with David and Jonathan, Steve.
Yeah, please.
I think Jonathan had a very similar trust in God and the same kind of spirit that David had, and I think they kind of hit it off immediately. If we remember back, Jonathan and his armor-bearer went up to attack the Philistines by themselves. And so it was a very similar situation with Jonathan and his armor-bearer, with here's David, this young boy, teenager going to confront Israel's enemy by himself, but with God's help. And if you look at the account with Jonathan, he said, look, God's going to either save by many or few, and we're going to go up and we'll see what happens. And I think David had the same attitude. I'm going to do my best. It's in God's hands, but I trust in God. And I think they both had that same kind of outlook.
That was the common bond.
Yeah, it was like the foundation of their relationship, for sure.
Isn't that
in my
interesting?
mind, anyways.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. Hand the mic back to Mark. Mark?
Thanks. If you go back a few chapters,
Okay.
there's a verse, it's either in 14 or 15, where Jonathan, remember when Saul tells the army, he basically tells them they can't eat?
Yeah, yeah.
And then Jonathan has the honey and they want to put him to death. But there's a verse where Jonathan basically says, I know my father is making mistakes as king, And then I'm not sure he was there, but when Samuel talks to Saul and says the kingdom's going to be rent from you and given to someone else, your neighbor, I think is the word he uses.
Yeah.
I think if Jonathan was there, I think he saw the writing on the wall that David was going to be the king at some point, and that his father wasn't, even though he stayed loyal to his father, I don't think he rebelled against his father, but, I think that's part of what Rich was saying as well. I think he knew that David was going to be the rightful king at some point. That might have had a lot to do with this closeness as well.
I think that's really an interesting point, yeah. I'm just looking. So if you think about the trust that Jonathan must have had in David. Rich, I think your comment about their common bond being a trust in God. And then they have this trust one to each other. And if Mark's conjecture is right, that Jonathan understood from an early point that David would be the one to succeed Saul, the trust that Jonathan placed in David is amazing. Because historically, when there was some sort of coup d'etat, when there was some sort of time when one king would be replaced by another, the incoming king, by practice, would destroy the entire family of the king that he deposed. And the reason he would do that is he wanted to get rid of the entire lineage of that deposed king. So that if the king was, killed, there would be nobody to succeed him on the throne. And this was, and Rich, correct me if I'm wrong, as a history guy, but this to me was the practice that was consistently practiced in ancient times. And now you've got David and Jonathan forming this friendship, and the trust that Jonathan had, not just in God, but to know that David would have this bond and allow Jonathan to live is remarkable. Yeah, Mark.
I found that verse, Steve, that I was thinking about.
Yeah.
Let me put my glasses on so I can see. Back in chapter 14, in verse 29, Jonathan says, "My father hath troubled the land. See, I pray you how my eyes have been enlightened." And this is after he ate the honey. He says, "Because I tasted a little of this honey." So I think that might be one of the turning points where he realizes my dad's not going to be here for long as king.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think when Saul now is greeted by the women as they're coming back from battle, and the women are saying, Saul's killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands, I think that's the turning point in Saul's mind, where he realizes that, oh, remember when Samuel came out and told me the kingdom was going to be taken from me? He didn't say who was going to take it. And now it's dawning on him, it's going to be this guy. David's the one. And what we're going to see now is this jealousy that Saul has towards David. And we're going to see how initially Saul responds to this jealous feeling that he has. And then next week, God willing, what we'll do is we'll talk about David being sort of on the run and we'll look at the places that he went and that sort of thing. But what we'll do now is we'll focus on the jealousy that Saul had with David. Any other comments? Okay, let's continue on then. So we're at 1 Samuel 18. We'll look at verse 8, and it says, Saul was very angry. The refrain galled him. They've credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What can he get but the kingdom? Now, you see, it's dawning on him. This is the guy. The next day, an evil spirit, verse 10, from God came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp, as he usually did. So before we read the next sentence, what do you think it means when it says an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Is that simply depression? Or do you think it's more than that?
I look at it as some type of mental. Yeah, Steve, I look at it as some type of mental illness that was promoted by the stress of leadership and of the knowledge that David was going to take his throne. And, even before he became king, remember he went out looking for his father's donkeys, and then he ended up prophesying anyway. So he had this inclination towards prophecy, but I think the stress of being king and some of his mistakes, and then Samuel saying the kingdom is going to be rent from you, I think put him in a real tough situation.
Yeah.
And they looked at it as an evil spirit from the Lord. And I don't look at it as kind of God like, putting an evil spirit into his mind. I think just the circumstances that he was put in affected him in a very emotional way.
Yeah. So when we think about that, I mean, there are people in our midst that struggle with mental illness, with depression and anxiety, and it's nothing to be messed with. I mean, it is very real. And I think we need as a community to really get rid of the stigma that sometimes has historically gone along with these things. And I think when I read this story about Saul, there's part of me that feels an empathy towards him. And I think it's important for us to recognize that, brothers and sisters, that sometimes we, particularly, and, I was with my mom and dad last night, we were chatting, and, there are a lot of people right now that are really struggling as a result of the isolation with COVID, struggling with, now it's getting dark. Great. So I got my seasonal depression meeting my COVID depression. This is not going to be a fun time, right? And, we can sort of lightheartedly say that, but it's real for a lot of people. And brothers and sisters, if there's anything that I can encourage, it's that we be on the lookout, not only for it in ourselves, but in others. And if you recognize it in yourself, seek help. The same way we'd seek help if we, had a problem with cholesterol or anything else. So here we see Saul, and he's received this angry spirit, and whatever that is, and in my mind it's some sort of, anxiety or depression or something. And it's causing him to react in a way that is, not good. So one of my favorite experiences, just as an aside, as a teacher, was years ago. I think it was at the Shippensburg or the Eastern Bible School. I had been asked to teach the teens. And there was a kid in the back of the room that was paying absolutely no attention at all. And he was really getting on me, and I didn't know how to handle it. And this was the subject. We were in 1 Samuel 18. And I said, Saul was very angry, verse 8. The refrain grated on him. And then it says, the next day an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. And it was at this point, and I'm proud to say this, that I reached behind me, and there was a blackboard, right? And remember the blackboards you'd write on chalk? I don't think they do that anymore. And there were these chalk erasers, little thing like maybe this big. Well, I picked up this chalk eraser, and I hurled it at the kid. And it went right over his shoulder, next to his ear, and hit the wall. It couldn't have been a better shot. It could have been a lot worse. And afterwards, I was like, I can't believe I did that. You know, I obviously wasn't trying to hit the kid, but it came a lot closer than I thought. So, I don't know if it was a spirit of wickedness or evil that came across me, but it really felt pretty good. And the class got a kick out of it. And the kid was like my best friend after that for some reason. I don't know. So Saul was afraid of David, it says in verse 12. The Lord was because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And I think that's really interesting. You know, here is Saul, who's twice now thrown a spear at David, trying to pin him to the wall. And then the very next verse tells us that it wasn't David who was afraid of Saul. It's Saul who was afraid of David. What a bizarre thing. And it shows that if God is for us, who can be against us? And so God was with David, and Saul recognized it. And the only response that Saul could have was, I've got to get this guy away from me. And so he sends David away. And then again, we see the same refrain. In everything he did, verse 14, David had great success because the Lord was with him. And as we go through the next few chapters over this week and next week, I want you to think about something, brothers and sisters. We've got David now, who has been told by Samuel that he is going to be the king. And yet, he's not the king. He's not yet been brought to the throne. And God is with David, but think about the experience of David from the point when he was told he'd be king over the next few years. David has had a spear thrown at him. David is is experiencing the ire of the most powerful man in the country. David is going to be on the run. He's going to be, running for his life. And yet, the passage says that the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. And so sometimes when we are experiencing, problems like depression or anxiety because of everything that's going on in the world, it doesn't mean that God's not with us. God is with us even in the dark times. And sometimes these things happen because it forms some sort of proving ground for the person in the life of the person that's struggling. I think of those passages in Hebrews where it talks about how Jesus was. Let's just turn there. I can't think of how to quote it, but it's Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews is like way in the back of the Bible. Hebrews, I think it's 10. 12, Hebrews 12. Let's fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame. And then he sat down at the right hand of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men. David is a precursor to Jesus. He's a type of Jesus in many ways. And you think about how David was receiving opposition from sinful men. And we're told to look to Jesus as our example. Why? Look at what it says there at the end of verse 3. So that you don't become weary and lose heart. Don't be surprised when difficulty rises in your life. Don't feel that because you're experiencing challenges and difficulty that God's not with you. These things sometimes happen, and it's a way that God strengthens us. It's a way that God helps us in the long run. In the short term, it's painful. And when we're experiencing this, the record tells us that we should look to the example of Jesus because he endured. He endured by looking to the future, by looking to the kingdom that would be given to him. And we should do the same so that we don't become weary and lose heart. Verse 7 of Hebrews 12, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you like children. For what child is not disciplined by his father? And I think that's what's happening with David here. David is experiencing this difficulty in his life, and it's discipline so that he can be molded by God through this process of discipline in such a way that when he ascends the throne, his character is going to be more reflective of God. David selected this boy from the fields where he was a soft pile of clay that could be molded into God's, to reflect God's character, as opposed to Saul, who was already a man, who was already one that everybody looked to, and Saul is now taken as he was and placed on the throne, and we see the trouble that resulted from that. His pride, his, the decisions that he made, his character wasn't molded. And I think this is why David is going through these challenges, so that God can mold him. Any comments or questions or thoughts? Okay.
Well, the only way to, as you said, to deal with these difficulties in our lives is to not look at the present, which we're swimming in the quicksand, but to look to the future.
Yeah, I think there's a balance there too, though, right? I mean, we don't want to just live in the future. We have to live in the present. But, we want to forget what's behind. And to me, that's one of the, for me personally, that's one of the biggest challenges. When I'm struggling mentally, it's like I'm worried about things that have happened in the past, and it's history, right? That's what my folks always said. It's history, Steve. Forget about it. It's behind you. And so we live in the present. And what's the passage in the New Testament? Forgetting what is behind. And Bill Cadell used to quote it all the time, probably from Hebrews. He quoted everything. I think it was Hebrews 4. Do you know what it is, Jim Sullivan? No. You do? All right. Somebody text us if you're watching. Ellen Schauger, who was always texting me. Last week we asked the question, when did David become king? We didn't know the time, and my phone rang, and it was Ellen with the answer. I think she said it was 30, but I can't remember. All right. So we're 1 Samuel 18, verse 15. So we just read that David had been sent away. He was successful in everything he did because the Lord was with him. Verse 15, when Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. And so next what we find is Saul now saying to David, okay, David, I'm going to reward you by giving you one of my daughters. And he first promises David that he was going to be given his older daughter, whose name was Merab. And that's in verse 17. But then through a series of events, Merab is actually given to somebody other than David. And so what we find next is we find that Saul is going to come back to David and said, I promised you Merab, but now I'm going to let you marry my daughter Michal. Verse 20. Now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. So Saul is afraid of David. He finds out that his daughter is in love with David, and Saul is pleased. Why? Verse 21. I'll give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. That's what we'll do. We'll get him married, and now David's attention is not going to be on Yahweh as God. It's not going to be on fighting the Israelites. He's going to have his attention focused on my beautiful daughter. And because he's not going to be single-minded, now he's going to let his guard down. And the Philistines will be able to get him. So Saul said to David, now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law. Verse 22, then Saul ordered his attendants, speak to David privately and say, look, the king's pleased with you, and his attendants all like you. Now become his son-in-law. And they repeated these words to David, but David said, do you think it's a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. I mean, that seems bizarre to me. A little known? I mean, everybody in the country is walking around saying, that he's all that. And yet, it shows us, I think, that this never went to David's head. He wasn't strutting around like the big man on campus. He still had a humble spirit. He was still showing great humility throughout all of this. Verse 24, when Saul's servants told what David had said, Saul replied, say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies. And then almost as a parenthetical note, it said Saul's plan, of course, was to have David fall by the hand of the Philistines. Where have we seen this? Where do we later see this very same approach? David and Uriah. David did the same thing to Uriah. I'm not going to kill him. I'll let the Philistines kill him. I'm going to let somebody else do my dirty work. And so what we see here is Saul sending David on a mission that Saul assumed would be certain death. Same thing David did to Uriah later. David was molded in the character of God. David was a man after God's own heart, save only, the record tells us time and again, for the matter of Uriah the Hittite. So this was, of course, the big fall of David. David's repentance was amazing, a great example for us. But what we see here is where I think the seed of this came into David's mind. And Saul's plan was to have David fall by the Philistines, it says in verse 25. And so David got his friends together, verse 27. He and his men went out and they killed not 100, but 200 Philistines. And then Saul gave him to his daughter Michal in marriage. And when Saul, verse 28, realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy for the rest of his days. And so what we find now in chapter 19 is Saul continuing this animosity towards David. Not only was Saul afraid of him, Saul was desiring to kill him. And that's really the balance of what we see here in the 19th chapter. Jonathan was very fond of David and warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Verse 4, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, let not the king do wrong. So not only is Jonathan's bond towards David such that he is warning him sort of behind the scenes, hey, David, my father's out for you. Don't let your guard down. He's now interceding before his father on David's behalf. Two different things. And to make intercession for someone is a step beyond. And it really shows I think, the bond that they're experiencing there. Thank you very much, Brother Jim Boyko. I got a text message, the passage that we were looking for. Oh, Katie Boyko. Thank you, Katie. Philippians chapter 3, verse 13. Let's just turn there. It's like having a fact checker, right? Philippians 3:13. It says, I know what it's to be in need. I know what it's to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in every situation. Verse 13 says, I can do everything through him who gives me strength. I don't think that's the passage we were looking for. But it's a good passage. Come on, Katie, step up your game. The one is like, forgetting what's behind, I press on towards the mark. Who's going to win? Yeah, who's going to win? Give me the verse. Rachel's got it. Okay. Jonathan spoke well of David. We're back in 1 Samuel 19. Saul listened to Jonathan, it says in verse 6, took this oath, as surely as Yahweh lives, David will not be put to death. He's swearing an oath here, brothers and sisters. As surely as Yahweh lives, David will not be put to death. And yet we know that Saul continually pursued David's life, even after this oath. I think we're going to end here, brothers and sisters. It's 10:15. What we find again here is that, let's continue for another couple of minutes. We'll see if we can finish this chapter. Verse 9, an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with a spear in his hand. While David was playing the harp, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. And that night, David made good his escape. So this is the third time now that Saul has tried to pin him to a wall. I mean, come on, David. Get out of there. And he does. So David leaves. Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. Now, brothers and sisters, turn with me to Psalm. We're going to look at Psalm 59, because this psalm was written by David about this very event. So if you look at the psalm, most of the psalms, or many of the psalms, will have titles. And this title in the psalm says, for the director of music to the tune of Do Not Destroy. You love that tune, Jim says. A mitcom, which was, I think, some sort of musical device, musical instruction. And then it says, this was written when Saul had sent men to watch David's house in order to kill him. And this gives us an insight into the mind of David when all of this is taking place. Deliver me from my enemies, O God. Protect me from those who rise up against me. It's a great lesson here, brothers and sisters, and it is on whom do we rely in times of difficulty. So often we can try to rely on ourselves, on my strength, my abilities. I can get through this. And what we see David doing is David just turning it over to God. Deliver me from my enemies, O God. Protect me from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from the evildoers and save me from bloodthirsty men. See how they lie in wait for me. Fierce men conspire against me for no offense or sin of mine, O Lord. I've done no wrong, yet they're ready to attack me. Arise to help me. Look on my plight, O Lord God Almighty, the God of Israel. Rouse yourself to punish all the nations, so show no mercy to wicked traitors. They return at evening, snarling like dogs, and prowl about the city. See what they spew from their mouths. They spew out swords from their lips. They say, who can hear us? But you, O Lord, laugh at them. You scoff at all those nations. O my strength, I watch for you. O God, you're my fortress, my loving God. God will go before me and will let me gloat over those who slander me. But do not kill them, O Lord, our shield, or my people will forget. In your might, make them wander about and bring them down for their sins of their mouth, for the words of their lips. Let them be caught in their pride, for the curses and lies they utter. Consume them in wrath. Consume them till they're no more. Then it will be known to the ends of the earth that God rules over Jacob. So this is a really interesting passage, and there are a lot of psalms like this where there are these what do they call them? Imprecatory psalms. These are psalms where David is almost calling God to punish his enemies, destroy them, put them to death, injure them. And we read these things and we think, gee, I'm kind of uncomfortable. I wouldn't want to, how does loving your enemies fit with a passage like this? And I don't know that I have a good answer for that. But what I know, in all of these imprecatory psalms, the psalmist will then turn back to God. And there's always it's not like David asking that he'll get revenge. It's for God's honor that he's praying these things. And that's what we see in verse 13. Then it will be known, he's asking God to deliver this punishment on his enemies. Why? Not for David's benefit. Verse 13 seems to imply that it's for God's benefit. Do all these things to these people, and then it will be known to the ends of the earth that God rules over Jacob. They return at evening snarling like dogs and prowl about the city. They wander about for food and howl if not satisfied. But I will sing of your strength. In the mornings I'll sing of your love, for you are my fortress, my refuge in times of trouble. O my strength, I sing praise to you. O God, you, O God, are my fortress, my loving God. And to me, this is how I want to just sort of conclude the class. In the midst of all of this difficulty that David is facing, and let's not lose sight of that. We look at David as this great warrior. We look at him as this hero of faith. He's a young man, and he's experiencing the hatred of the most powerful man in the nation. And he's probably deathly afraid. And he's probably feeling the weight of that tension and stress on him. And despite that, or because of that, he turns to God for help. And I think that's the lesson for us. Sandy, just a minute, babe.
I think I said it in the morning, outrageous, so knowing that in the morning.
Yeah, so at night the dogs are out snarling, and then in the morning David has the confidence to know that he's not going to have been eaten by the dogs. Yeah, good point.
How do you look at verse 10 of
I closed my Bible, Dad. What does it say?
my God on whom I rely? God will go before me and will let me gloat over those who slander. And that's the gloat.
Yeah,
Is sort of, is that an emotion
sure it is.
of pride?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe. I don't know the answer. Jim Sullivan.
In another version, it says, "Look in triumph over my enemies."
Look in triumph over my enemies. All right. Look, I want